and it's about parables. I know you know what a parable is, but I'm going to remind you. It comes from the word that means to lay down beside of. It's an illustration, an analogy, and I don't know what that is, but it's a parable. It's something similar. So Jesus used something that the people were familiar with that didn't know anything about. It's interesting to me that parables concealed and revealed, two opposites, right? How do you do that at one time? Thank you. Conceal and reveal. Well, the concealing and the revealing has to do with the receivers. If their heart was not right, they couldn't receive it. If it was, they received it. So he taught the disciples, his followers, and the other people didn't understand. Thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks, heavy. And I've got an illustration that I want to show you as a parable that happened in real life 20 years ago. I had this old friend we were going to church with, and I've got this son. I'm not going to tell you how old he is, but the old man was going to sell his business, and he was thinking about selling it to our son, and he was thinking about buying it. And he came to me one day and he says, "Does your son have stick-to-itiveness?" Yeah, stick-to-itiveness. Well, of course, I wanted to answer that in the affirmative, but I didn't want to go too far and lie about it, and I certainly didn't want to put him in a bad light. So what do? I said, "Why don't you ask his father-in-law? He might be more objective." And he said, getting anything out of him is like pulling a stump. Now, I know most of you have never pulled a stump, but surely you understand before heavy equipment that was a job. I had a garden one time years ago, and right on the edge next to my neighbor's property was a tree. Right there by that last row. Now that tree was a pain, I'm telling you. So I cut it down. Well, cutting it down removed the competition from the plants that I wanted to grow there. But I still had to go around it. And you can't just go around the stump, you've got to get around the roots. So I began to try to remove the stump. And I dug all around it and dug all around it and dug all around it. And I got my chopping axe and I chopped the roots off. I worked on that stump 3 years. Not every day, but it took 3 years to get rid of, and the tree wasn't that big around, to get rid of that stump. So I'm telling you, pulling a stump is hard work. Getting anything out of this guy, he said, was hard work. So he'd rather not even ask him. So that's a parable. All right, Jesus used that a lot, and he used it in verse 11 of this same chapter. He says, he used parables because, where is that verse? There it is. Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. All right. Now let's look at chapter 13, verse 31. It says, and another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. The only mustards that I'm personally familiar with is mustard greens, but I don't, it's been a long time, all kind of greens, but apparently that's not what he's talking about. And I don't guess I've ever seen one, but he speaks of this mustard seed becoming, or as an herb. I had to look that up. An herb is a plant that comes up in season from the seed, thrives, produces fruit, and at the end of the season withers and dies back. Now, it says it's the greatest of the herbs. In other words, I think the largest. And it said, it becometh a tree. Now, I worried about this a long time, worried with it. I've been in the woods all of my life, quite a bit. Lived in the country all I could. Worked in the woods. I worked for wages one time, and I worked in the woods for warmth for 40 years. But I know what a tree is. But I looked up this word in, I think it's Strong's exhaustive concordance. You got every word in the Bible and where it's listed, where it's found. So I looked up the word tree. I hate to do that. I ought to know a tree. But I looked up the word tree, and in this concordance, the definition was a tree. So I got down my Webster's New Modern Dictionary, and it said a tree is a plant that grows up and has one main stem or trunk from which the branches grow out from, the limbs branch out from. Okay, so the difference in a herb and a tree is the tree don't die back every year. Now, it does lose its leaves and fertilizes itself with those dead leaves, but the tree stays till something happens to kill it, where an herb dies back every summer. Well, I still don't know what he's talking about for sure. It said, now, an herb and a tree is totally different things, right? But he said this is the greatest of herbs and becometh a tree. So I even looked on the internet. I hate the internet, but I looked up there, and it gave pictures of mustard trees. And some of them, someone else I read after said that you could even climb the tree. But I saw the pictures, and the pictures were one trunk, and up so high, the foliage branched out like an umbrella. I don't know what all that has to do with any of this, except to say that I think that the moral of the story, or the meaning of the parable, is the kingdom of heaven started small and in the eyes of the world insignificant, but will become the greatest nation, greatest kingdom of the earth. All other nations will flow unto it. I'm looking forward to that time with great anticipation. Probably because I'm old. When I was young, I didn't look forward to that so much. But I do now. Anyway, he goes to another parable. He says, the kingdom of heaven is likened to leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. I'm not a cook, but I remember growing up, my mother and her sisters, her generation, would make bread, and they would use yeast, which is a leaven. They would put that yeast in the batter, put it in a pan, put a wet wash hand towel over it, and let it sit overnight. The next morning, it would be twice the size. They put it in the oven and bake it, and it would grow some more. So the leaven that they used in the time that Jesus walked on the earth as man was not yeast. It was, I forget now where it all comes from, but it has to do with fermentation. But they put it in one spot. It said hid in 3 measures of meal. You know what meal is? Well, I think of cornmeal. But meal is, flour is meal. They tell me that leaven will not work in grain that has not been ground. I don't understand all that, and I don't know what that has to do with anything, but yeah, I think it's flour he's talking about. He hid this pinch of leaven, let it set, and it permeates the whole mass and expands it. It says 3 measures of meal. I don't know. I don't think there's anything significant about that. There probably is, but I just don't understand what it is. But I know 3 measures of meal is about 8 gallons a third of a bushel. That's a lot of meal, isn't it? That's a lot of batter. That's a lot of bread. But I think the point is that this leaven, now, wait a minute. In the scriptures, most of the time, leaven is referring to evil, is it not? Paul talked to the church at Corinth about removing the leaven because you are unleavened. And he was talking about sin. Well, someplace it tells us that leaven is a reference to malice and wickedness as opposed to truth and sincerity. So I think the point is, here again, the kingdom of heaven started off small with the disciples there at the sea of near Jordan, and it will wind up. It won't wind up. It will continue to grow and mature progressively and become the greatest kingdom of the earth, where Jesus will sit on David's throne in the new temple in Jerusalem. That's just a few days down the road. Well, I'll come back to this in a minute. Well, now let's skip verses 34 through 44, 43. Of course, Brother John ably explained all of that last week concerning the parable of the wheat and the tares. I don't know much about wheat, but I understand weeds, and I remember cornfields, and I know that when the corn gets up, say 18 inches high, I remember being in the cornfield with my uncle. He had a corn patch. He grew up in a farmer's house, and after World War II, he thought he was a farmer. He went to work for Alcoa, and in February, March next year, he told his co-worker, he said, "Well, I guess I better go give him my 2 weeks' notice." And he said, "What for?" He said, "I got to put a crop in." And the guy said, "You think you're going to make more money putting in a crop than working here at Alcoa?" So he reconsidered and stayed with him a while. But he was still a farmer, and he put in about a 40-acre field of corn one time. And I was just a small boy, but we came up and spent a week or two with Uncle Clarence. And he had just bought a brand new Alice Chalmers tractor. It wasn't the biggest and it wasn't the smallest, but it was a new tractor. And we rode out down River Street across that old bridge. You ever been across that bridge? If you have, you're old. Across that bridge, the road curved to the right, and over to the left was this cornfield. And the corn was about that high. And I swear I couldn't tell the difference in the Johnson grass and the corn. You had to have an expert to hoe out the Johnson grass, or you'd plow up the corn, which we did. Well, let's go to verse 44, where Jesus gives another parable. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. You got a picture of this in your mind? This man is walking across somebody else's property. Maybe it's federal land, I don't know. He finds a treasure. You know, the most expensive things that we know of in this earth is gold and silver and diamonds and precious stones. And they're all hidden in the ground, aren't they? I don't know what he found, but whatever it was, he went and hid it. Now, was that right? To find something that belonged to somebody else and hide it? No, it's not right. So he hid it so no one else would get it, till he could sell everything he had owned in order to buy the whole property. And then he would have possession of this precious whatever it was. Well, the point is not that he found this and then hid it. The point is that there was something very, very valuable, so valuable that he gave up, sold everything he possessed in order to purchase this field that was valuable. And then again he says in verse 45, the kingdom is like unto a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. This merchant man, most commentators refer to him as a jeweler. I've known a couple of jewelers, and I guess they like pretty things, but what are they in business for? They're in business to make money. And I can't help but think that this merchant man searched land and sea till he could find the most valuable, greatest pearl that he could find. And I don't know why he wanted that, except, do you have things you want, you like, just because you like them? Yeah, my wife doesn't even like some of them. But I like them. They're valuable to me, which means nothing. But I guess this merchant man decided that if he had this great pearl, this one single pearl, when he sold it, he would make more profit than he would off all his other inventory. But I don't know that has anything to do with the parable. The parable tells us he found a treasure. He was looking for a treasure, a pearl, expensive, most expensive pearl, and he sold everything that he possessed in order to possess this special pearl. Now, is he talking about, some say that this is a reference to Israel, the nation of Israel. You know, Israel was a special, very special people to Jesus. He said, they're the apple of my eye. They were very special to him. Is that what he's talking about here? The nation of Israel? Or is he talking about is he talking about Jesus? Is he talking about the gospel? Is he talking about salvation? Well, I have a personal, not the favorite, but a favorite scripture, and it's found in Proverbs 23:23, and it says, "Buy the truth and sell it not." This gives me the idea that truth is of great value. Well, in the book of John, Jesus is praying to the Father on behalf of the children of God, his disciples. And he says, "Father, sanctify them through thy word. Thy word is truth." Wait, that's not right. Sanctify them through the truth. Thy word is truth. It's pretty precious, pretty valuable, is it not? The kingdom of heaven is very valuable, great value, isn't it? Well, let's move on to the next one. In verse 47, it says, "The kingdom of heaven is likened to a net that was cast into the sea and gathered of every kind." Have you ever fished with a net? Well, I hope not, because that's illegal. But I have. It probably wasn't illegal then. That was a long time ago. But when you drag a net, you catch everything in the way of that net. Old boots, bottles, tin cans, whatever is in that pond or lake. Never seined or used a net in the lake, but just a pond. But you catch everything that's in it, right? Again, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a net that was cast into the sea and gathered every kind. Now, these people were very familiar with fishing with a net. You know, I think it's a pretty good way to catch fish, because you have to get them on the hook the way we fish, and sometimes they get off. I don't know how they do that. I tell you, this illustration comes to my mind. I'm sorry, I can't help it. There are rough fish and there are game fish. I was fishing on the Big Eddy down on the Neches River in East Texas when I was a teenager, me and my buddy in a little flat bottom boat, and he got a hold of this fish. And that fish fought and fought and fought, and he got him up in the boat. Well, he was holding the rod up like this, and this gar, this long, was hanging from his hook. And we sat there at the end of of the boat with our mouths hanging open, each one of us was thinking in our mind just as quickly as we could think, what are we going to do? You know, the gar has a mouth about that long, just like a saw blade on both sides. So we were afraid to touch it. But we didn't have to. In a minute, that fish flounced, and off he came off that hook and went right back in the water. But that's rough fish. There are a lot of rough fish. To me, a trout is a rough fish. I never could eat one that I thought was good. I even went to Chastain's on the White River one time. I thought, surely if anybody knows how to cook trout, they do. They didn't. Verse 48, when it was full, the net, they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels and cast the bad away. So they separated the good from the bad. We do the same thing today when we're fishing, don't we? If they're too small, we throw them back. If they're the wrong kind, we throw them back. Now verse 49 says, so shall it be at the end of the world. The angel shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just. What does that remind you of? Does that not remind you of the parable of the wheat and the tares? When they're all dragged to the shore, they are separated carefully, one from the other, the good from the bad. And shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. You can read about this in the book of Revelation. I think it's mostly in chapter 19. Jesus knows them that are his. The angels have instructions from Jesus, so they know also that at that point they will be separated. Now, I'm not sure I understand all this about the kingdom of heaven. Who will be in the kingdom of heaven? There is a kingdom of heaven on earth right now, but it's a spiritual kingdom, and I think this one he's talking about here is a physical kingdom that will take place at the end of this age, which will be at the end of the Great Tribulation period. I mean, the Battle of Armageddon. Yeah, same thing. And will last 1,000 years. And then I've been wanting to ask somebody about the transition from the millennial reign into the New Jerusalem. I don't know that it's important, but there is some sort of transition there. Anyway, we're talking about the kingdom of heaven that we're all looking forward to if we're prepared to meet the Lord. Are you prepared to meet the Lord? I think probably most of you are, not all of you, but you ask a person that, and nearly everybody will say yes. And some of them know real well they're not. Well, even saved people, many saved people are not prepared to meet the Lord. There are things that we need to be doing before the Lord comes back. Even children of God, we're prepared to meet Him as far as our eternal destiny is concerned, but we're supposed to be about the Father's business. And we need to get a good idea of how hot hell is. We need to consider the great misery that will be for those people who are not prepared to meet the Lord, who have not repented and placed their faith in Jesus. All right. In verse 51, Jesus said, have you understood all these things? He's talking to his disciples. He said, do you understand what I'm telling you? Well, I'm teaching you. And they said, yes, Lord. Well, did they understand it? If you were asked that question, could you answer in the affirmative? Well, I would probably say, yeah, I think so. I think they thought they understood it, and I think I understand it. But there's a lot of it I know I don't understand. But since they said yes, and Jesus knew their heart, why He asked them, I don't know, maybe for their own good, but when they said, yes, we understand, then He said, verse 52, therefore every scribe which is instructed into the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old. Now, if I understand this correctly, He said, okay, if you understand this, You are as a scribe. You know what a scribe was? That's where we get our word scribble and all kinds of other words. Transcribe, subscribe. It's a writer. And the writers that they were familiar with were Jewish writers who copied the scriptures. Can you imagine pen and ink and copying the scriptures? It's hard to imagine, isn't it? How high a stack of paper would it take to cover the Bible or the Old Testament? They copied the scriptures. In order to write the scriptures, you got to know what it says. You got to read each letter, each word. So these people were well versed in the scriptures. They knew the word. I was talking to a fellow the other day, just this past week, in a local nearby sister church. A friend of his, also a member, came up to him and said, our pastor's going to be on vacation next week. And he said, I went to him the other day and said, I'd like to hear this friend of mine preach. He said, he knows the Old Testament like nobody knows the Old Testament. He said, who is he? He said, he's a rabbi. Can you imagine? They knew the scriptures. They not only they knew them, they wrote them, and they taught the scriptures. They also served as attorneys somewhat. They drew up legal documents. So in my mind, they were the elite. They knew the word and they taught the word. So Jesus says, you are a scribe. I think that's what he's saying. And he said, instructed in the kingdom of heaven, and that is like a man is a householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old. His treasure is simply a place of deposit, from what I understand. It's a place where you keep it. I don't know about now, but a few years ago, homemakers had 2 or 3 sets of plates, silverware, and stuff like that to eat out of. And they kept the fine china in the cabinet until they had special guests. Not just guests, but special guests. You remember drinking coffee out of a teacup? China teacup? You don't remember that? I am old. Well, they kept the good stuff for special occasions. Well, that, there may be some other illustrations like that, but they kept it up so it wouldn't get damaged, I guess. But I think he's talking about the truths of the kingdom, the truths of the gospel, the truth, God's word. This householder has it in a protected place, but notice it says, he bringeth forth out of its place things new and old. Now, I remember one time when my dad was old, but he wasn't as old as I am now. And I said, Dad, everything sooner or later will outlive its usefulness. He didn't agree with that. Well, my wife tells me the same thing. And I don't necessarily agree with that either, but if it's not wore out, it's still useful no matter how old it is. Well, I think what he's talking about here is truth. Scripture. One time when I was a little boy, not long after World War II, we lived at 1917 Elm Street. And one day my little brother and I were out in the front yard just a few feet from the porch, and Mother was on the porch. It was only 2 steps high. And I've got a picture in my mind yet today. She was wearing a light-colored print dress. I don't know what she was doing. I don't know what she was talking about. But she said, the Lord is coming back soon. Well, I thought, before supper? Tomorrow? Next week? A week is a long time to a little boy. I have never forgot that. Now, I think I had heard that from the pulpit, but for her to say that, it really got my attention, and it's never left my attention. Now, since that time, I have learned that God has given us things that indicate that time is near. And if anybody is surprised by the second coming of Christ, it shouldn't be you or me if you're a believer, because we understand. I mean, we have read what he said, to watch the fig tree when it starts putting forth its leaves. Summer is nigh. Is the fig tree putting forth its leaves today? Is it blooming, blossoming? I think so. I don't think there's any question about it. You know, they said 100 years ago, they said the Lord's coming back soon. Even the scriptures 2,000 years ago said the Lord is coming back soon. And he is. There's no question about it. Okay, we need to be about the Father's business. Things old and new. I think he's talking about things that you learned long time ago, as well as those things more recently understood. Now, I learned a lot of things a long time ago that I didn't understand for a long time. Still don't understand some of them. But we grow in that way, don't we? So we are to use everything that we have at our disposal. And we should use these things in our treasury when the time is right. In the proper season and proper occasion, we're to use what we have, what we know, to warn others of the coming judgment, to tell them of the way of salvation, man's need for the Lord, when the time is right. Now then, verses 53 to 56, well, we got time to read that? Yeah. What do we got, 2 minutes? 15 minutes? Okay. And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed thence, and when he was coming to his own country, and I think that's the city of Nazareth, where he was brought up, he taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished, and said, Whence hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren James and Joseph and Simon and Judas and his sisters, are they not all with us? Whence then hath this man all these things? And they were offended at him. Can you imagine someone that you grew up with living in the White House? I don't know who would want to, but a person who has been elevated to a great position of authority or honor or whatever, you knew him when he was a kid. There's nothing special about him. I think that's what these people were thinking. You know, we used to play sand-lot baseball with Jesus. We used to go fishing with him. How can he have such wisdom and power in his preaching? They were so set against him that their minds were closed. And that's the reason first of all, verse 57, Jesus said, the prophet is not without honor save in his own country and in his own house. In other words, a traveling prophet receives respect and honor everywhere he goes, except when he comes back home, because they knew him and knew of his humble beginnings. But why couldn't they remember the angels announcing his birth? Well, maybe I don't know. But I think they should have known, but they didn't. So they wouldn't accept him because they knew him when he was young. And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. What was the purpose of mighty works? To confirm the message or the messenger. And their mouths, or their heads, hearts were so closed, there wasn't any point in it at this point. How sad. Well, I really don't have a conclusion to this lesson. But when somebody asks you, what do you know? What do you tell them? I used to say sometimes, Jesus saves. Now I say, Jesus is coming again soon. I'm looking forward to that. I hope you are too. I thank you for your kind attention this morning. It's good to see you here. I'm glad you're with us. You have a bulletin. If you don't, I'll get you one. And it has the announcements in it. And that bulletin is a list of people to pray for. Are you praying for them? Well, I hope you are. Do you have others that we need to add to this list of prayer requests?
If I could just give you an update.
All right.